Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bridgehead on 5:30 a.m. at 1:30 p.m. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I am the Communications Director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. That website can be found at unmaskingchoice.ca, where you can also find recordings of other radio interviews that we've done in preceding weeks. Now, as those of you who have been listening along will know, in preceding weeks we've done all sorts of interviews with different professors and academics and historical figures, taking a look at injustices of the past and how people have responded to those injustices and the experiences of people who have gone through those injustices. Now, the interview we have for you today is with a woman named Eva Schloss. And now, if you're not familiar with her story, I would really encourage you to get familiar with her story, and the interview that we're going to be playing for you this afternoon will be the first step in that direction. Eva Schloss was born in 1929 in Austria, and she is best known these days as Anne Frank's stepsister. All of you will, of course, have heard of the diary of Anne Frank, the young Jewish girl who hid in the Netherlands from the Germans and eventually died in a concentration camp with her mother and her sister. Well, Eva Schloss' mother lost her son and husband in the concentration camps and eventually married Otto Frank, that being, of course, Anne Frank's father. And Eva Schloss and the Schloss family actually knew the Franks when they were all in Amsterdam during that period before they had to go in hiding from the Nazis. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Eva Schloss's story. So the first question I want to ask you is, what are your earliest memories?
Well, from Vienna, my birthday parties, I think. You know, we had a wonderful garden and we had lots of friends. And I loved it. It was in May, and in May at the time used to be always lovely weather and so on. So we had lovely, lovely parties. And, you know, I liked that very much.
What do you remember of your family before you moved to Amsterdam, before you fled Austria to head to Amsterdam?
Well, I had a cousin from my father's sister's a daughter. She was my age. We were very, very close. The sister of my mother got a little baby boy, which was about a year old, and I loved to play with him. And my grandparents had lots of brothers and sisters, and they had lots of cousins and children, so we had a big extended family. And, you know, I loved all this, to have big reunions and big parties and big outings, skiing in winter, skating, swimming in summer, mountaineering, you know, really lovely.
What made your family decide to leave for the Netherlands?
Well, the Hitler time, we knew that Hitler was doing terrible things to Jewish people in Germany, and you know, we knew that he might want to. There were votings and propaganda, Nazis in Austria. We knew that the German army might occupy Austria. And my father had a shoe factory, and he had connections in Holland. There was as well a big shoe industry, and so he decided that would be best for him to move there and start a new factory, and you know, will be able to make a living.
So he chose to leave the Netherlands because he had pre-existing connections there already?
Yes, that's right, yes.
So when your family set up house in Amsterdam, what was life like living in the Netherlands?
Well, you know, we came rather late. We came in February 1940, and so we had a few months, which was lovely. The Dutch were very friendly towards refugees. At school, everybody wanted to be my friend, and I was very happy. But of course, in May 1940, so after 3 months, there was a war, and the German invaded Holland, and then things started to change for Jewish people again. Not as bad as in Austria at first, but it started to become dangerous to go out in the street, and especially young men and men were arrested, and we lived under lots of restrictions, and so, you know, life was scared again.
So you lived nearby quite a few other of Jewish families as well as Dutch Jewish families, according to many things that you've written. What was it like to be a Jew in the Netherlands under the Nazi invasion? Because as I understand it, the Jews weren't arrested right away.
No, because they knew the population, they didn't want to alienate the Dutch population, they wanted to try to be friendly with them. But of course they hated them, most of them hated the Nazis, because after all they had conquered the country. And so they were much more careful how they implement the restrictions on Jewish people. And at first the Dutch said, but they're not Jews, they're Dutch, and it doesn't matter what religion they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, but of course they really wanted to get to all the Jews, so they did it more slowly.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually they started to deport people and arrest people, and it became very, very unpleasant, saying the least of it. And then after 2 years, they called up about 10,000 young Jewish men and to be deported to Germany. And this was the time when, no, not just men, young people. And that was the time many Jewish people went into hiding, including the Frank family and us.
Mm-hmm. So you first met the Frank family when you were in Amsterdam, am I right?
Yes, that's right. Well, first, of course, Anna, because we were exactly the same age.
Mm-hmm.
We were 11 years old at the time. And, it was a big square, and we used to play outside in the street.
Right, so what were your memories then of Anne Frank?
Well, if I would give you a lot of details, I would make it up. She was just one of my playmates, and she was very lively and very nice, and but I was a tomboy, and she was really a sophisticated little girl. So, we were not best friends. She was interested in her hairstyles, in her clothes, in boys, and I had a brother, so boys were no mystery to me. And, we used to play with what kids do, skipping and gossiping, and, but I can't say I had a particularly impression of her more than any other of my friends.
Mm-hmm. How many young Jewish children were there that were part of your group of playmates?
So there were quite a lot of more from Germany than from Austria, because that was a new part of Amsterdam, was developed in the 20s, and a lot of the apartments had stood empty. So when Jewish refugees came, they could move in there. And so that's why I would say on this square there must have been perhaps 30 Jewish youngsters from the age of babies to teenagers.
When was it that your family decided to go into hiding because it was too dangerous to be out in public in Amsterdam?
Oh, well, my brother got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany. And this is when we went into hiding, in July 1942.
1942. So what was it like to live in hiding?
Well, that was, of course, I was with my mother. We couldn't find a place who would take 4 people. So the boredom was, for me, nearly unbearable, I was, as I said to you, I was a very outdoor, lively child, 40, and suddenly I had to sit still day in, day out, day in, day out. So that was terrible. But as well, the Nazis did house searches. They came into houses, knocked on doors, and searched the houses. So we had the hiding place within the hiding place.
Right.
So when they came at night, we had to quickly go into those hiding places, hoping they wouldn't find us. So, of course, we were never easy going to sleep, would they come again? Would they find us? So there was a lot of tension as well.
What was the Dutch family who hid you like?
Well, we went in about 7 different places. So there were people who hated the Germans. Once it was a single lady who was a teacher. Once it was a family with 2 young boys. But all anti-German, anti-Nazis, very patriotic Dutch. And usually good Christian people who thought, they had to help other people.
So the attitude of the Dutch toward the Jews was much different than in many of the other countries.
Yes. But having said that, there was as well a big Nazi party as well, like in all the occupied countries. So I would say 70% were anti-Nazis, 30% were sympathetic to the Nazis and helped the Nazis as well, betrayed Jews and things like that.
That brings us right to the next part of your story. So what do you remember of your betrayal and arrest? Who was it who betrayed your hiding place?
It was my father and brother had to change hiding place, and the Dutch nurse who said she said she knows a safe house. She took them there to this place, which was really a Nazi trap. And my mother and me had gone to visit, so they could follow us, and so all four of us were arrested. But it was a Dutch nurse who was really a double agent.
Okay, and then where were you sent after your arrest?
We were sent first to a prison, sent to a holding camp, and within a week we were already on transport to Auschwitz.
What was the holding camp like?
Well, we were there just a couple of days, so I can't really remember much. But it was run by Jewish people under supervision of the Germans, and families they were not sleeping together, but they could sit after work. You could go and visit each other. There was, I wouldn't say a lot of food, but it was enough to keep alive. You had your own clothes. It wasn't too bad. The bad thing was that you never knew when you were sent on transport to the east.
Was there an awareness of what transport to the east meant?
Yes, definitely. We all knew what was going on in Germany and Poland.
So then after a week, your whole family was put on the transport and was sent, which camp was everyone sent to? Auschwitz.
And that was the biggest.
And how old were you at that time?
15, just 15.
15 years old. What are your memories of that time?
Well, fear of being killed, which we nearly were, and then, of course, terrible deprivation, starving, illness, hard labor, lice, terrible. Selections.
How, in the face of all of that, when you're only a girl of 15 years old, how did you survive that time?
Well, I was 15. I had an experienced life, not the wonderful life which we had in Austria. I wanted to have a boyfriend. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have children. I never ever gave up hope that a miracle would happen and we would make it. My mother and me were lucky we made it, but my father and brother didn't survive.
And they passed away in Auschwitz?
No, they were taken out of Auschwitz when the Russians were approaching, and thousands and thousands of people were taken away, marched into Austria and Germany after the war. Those were called the death marches, and many people perished. That was in December, January 44, 45. So you can imagine it was midwinter, it was terribly cold, people were not fed, they had practically no clothes, people couldn't make it.
So when was the camp that you were liberated, and when were you and your mother freed?
In January 45. That was, I must admit, if we would have had to wait till the end of the war, I would certainly not have made it. This winter was one of the coldest on record. Sometimes I had no shoes, I had to walk in the snow barefoot. I had terrible frostbite. My toes were all open wounds, which got, of course, infected. I wouldn't have made it much longer.
What do you remember of the liberation of the camp?
Well, there wasn't really... the Germans left with most of the inmates, and we were for 10 days about on our own, and then suddenly a few Russians appeared. And that was the liberation, there was no... there were very few people left. a few hundred women. Most of them were very, very weak. A lot of them still died, even after the Germans had left, even when the Russians had been there already. And, we didn't know what was going to happen. There was wasn't really joyful or anything,
Right, right. After the camp was liberated, where did you and your mother go?
Well, the war wasn't finished, so there was fierce fighting in Poland, and Germans even came back one day, and so the Russians decided they wouldn't leave us there, and they transported us eastward. We couldn't go westward, of course. Mm-hmm. And so we traveled with the help from the Russians in cattle trucks still, because that was the transportation even of the troops. Mm-hmm. And we traveled for 4 months till we ended up in Odessa. And we traveled through Russia, through Poland, through Ukraine, and we saw terrible, terrible devastation. The Germans had really burned down every town, every village. There was really nothing left. Mm-hmm.
So after you ended up in Odessa, how did you and your mother begin to rebuild your life? If you had...
Well, in Odessa we were waiting for the end of the war. Mm-hmm. And when that came, of course, then we really realized we had survived. That was then a big party there. And then we were anxious to hear, of course. We had no idea what had happened to our family.
Right.
So we were very keen to get back to Amsterdam, to hoping they would be there.
Right.
Or to find out what has happened.
Right.
So eventually, again, after a long journey, we got back to Amsterdam, and after about a month, we heard the devastating news that my father and brother had not made it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was, for us, the worst.
Right.
Definitely, Eventually we could get over our own degradation, our own suffering, but the loss of your family is something you just don't get over ever.
Right, right. And then I understand, then your mother got remarried.
Yeah, but after 8 years,
8 years.
We first struggled through the difficulties to make a living, mm-hmm. I went back to school, to try to make friends, but, it was very, very, after the war, there were terrible conditions everywhere in the
right.
continent. And so life was really hard, that we couldn't get over the loss, that everybody told you who they had lost, and, where the children without parents, that their parents had lost their children. It was a really, really horrific time afterwards.
And you were in the Netherlands at this time?
Told us, of course, he had lost his whole family, and he came to visit very often and helped me and my mother, and so they got very close. Mm-hmm. And then when I finished school, I didn't know what to do with my life, and Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer, which I didn't mind. I didn't really care what I was going to do. I was still very, very depressed. And I went to London for a year to become an apprentice in a studio. And that is where I met my husband. And then Otto came over one day, and I told him that I wouldn't get married. I would go back to Amsterdam to my mother. I wouldn't leave her alone. And then he said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love as well. And when you are settled, we'd like to get married. And this is what happened. So we got married in 1952, mm-hmm. and my mother and Otto in 1953.
Mm-hmm. What was it like after that?
Well, we stayed in London, and I never talked about, not to my husband, not to anybody, about what had happened to me in the war. And I was very shy. When you grow up, you are told you are like vermin, you're not worth a life. Mm-hmm. I'd lost all my confidence, all my love for life, really. And we were very poor, we earned £3 a week, and we lived in furnished accommodation. And London was, of course, there was rationing and a lot of bombing sites. They didn't have the money to rebuild. Mm-hmm. It was a hard life, Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I desperately wanted a family, and nothing happened, so I was very upset. But then I had some hormone treatment because in the camp, through the bad food and everything, my whole system had gone haywire.
Right.
So eventually I had some hormone treatment. I was able to conceive. And that was for me a big change, to be able to give birth to a wonderful, healthy baby daughter. Then I started to become more of an ordinary human being, I think. But, my children, we have 3 daughters, they still say, well, you were not an ordinary mother. So obviously the scars were still with me. And I never spoke about anything till the 80s. And I think then when I started to speak, then the burden which had been heavily burdening me, I think that was lifted then. It took good 40 years to get over it.
Right. And you wrote that at the same time that you were struggling with your pain, your mother and Otto Frank were traveling around promoting Anne Frank's diary.
That's right, yes. Yeah. And they were really, it was a wonderful marriage. They really worked together on every project. And my mother was actually very happy, I must say. And of course, the loss of a son, you never get over either. But Otto and my mother really loved each other.
What made you finally decide to speak up in the 1980s and tell your story?
That was an Anne Frank exhibition which came to London, created from the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. And I was asked to speak there. And, as I say, I'd never spoken. But, I was not asked in advance. I was just invited. And then, being there, they said, and now I want to say something. Well, I didn't want to say anything.
Right.
But I was sort of had to,
Right.
And that really changed my life.
Right.
And I decided then I should write my story. People asked me to. And that is when I wrote my first book, Eva Story. And then they asked me to speak everywhere, and and that was really then a watershed for me.
Did it help your family to understand more of what you had gone through when you finally started to speak out about your experience?
Yes, but in the family it was still sort of a subject you didn't touch. It's difficult for children to know what their mother has suffered. So, they didn't really want to speak about it. But, of course, then there was a play created, and then they came for me, Remembering the World of Anne Frank, which was mainly about my life. And they saw the play, of course, and so they started to be a bit more involved with the whole story.
So for people who are around my age, it's often very hard to grasp.
What age are you?
I'm 25.
Right.
And it's very hard to grasp what has happened to people like you and even people like my grandparents growing up during the war, and to think that such things actually happened in what was called Western civilization and
I know.
very long ago.
I think that's why the interest in the Holocaust is growing continuously, because people know now more about it and just can't comprehend how it could have happened, why the world didn't stop it, how it could have happened and what went wrong and why, and people starting to, there are lots of universities who teach the Holocaust, lots of young people choose the Holocaust for that thesis, and it's really thousands of books have been written from all kind of corners to try to understand, even from the Nazi point of view, and so that it can't be repeated. That is really what is behind it. And unfortunately, we haven't learned a lot. There's still an enormous lot of killing and hatred and discrimination. And that is a sad thing.
As a Holocaust survivor, then, looking at the world today and looking at what you experience, what message would you give to people of my generation?
Well, we have to really pull up our socks and work together to change the world. And, young people think they have a right on everything. They're very spoiled now. That's perhaps a reaction of the bad times which the grandparents had. But we have to be more sociable aware what is going on. And I think a lot of young people are. And it is more, our grandchildren, they're all between 15 and 25. They're all very decent people, all very interested in what goes on in the world. But once they stand in the life and they earn a living, find it difficult, then they become more selfish, and all the good intentions are thrown in the wind. And so I think that people of more of between 30 and 50, 60, those are the people who are more selfish and want to have a good time and don't care so much about the terrible things which are still going on in the world.
So you're saying that in order to actually to fight these things and work towards these things, then we have to sacrifice and not be so focused on having a good time.
Definitely, yes. We are much more open now. We know what is happening all around the world. We are a mixed society. We meet people from all over. There are a lot of very, very, very poor country, children dying every minute of the day, and we know about this now. And we don't really do enough about it.
Right.
And what I think is the difference between rich and poor is getting bigger and bigger. And I think eventually, people won't put up with that. And I'm afraid, if we don't change, there will be wars again and unrest and revolutions and things like that.
What's the one message you'd like to leave your audiences with when you speak about your story?
Well, you have to be active. You have to know what is going on in the world, and you have that active part to try to improve things.
Well, Mrs. Schloss, thank you so much for your time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Eva Schloss, Holocaust survivor and Frank's stepsister, and as I'm sure you'll all agree, a very inspiring woman. Thank you all for joining us this week, and please tune in again next week or listen to us online, and we'll have another interview ready for you next week. Have a great weekend. Bye.